carnage are handy tools in the hands of deep state operatives looking to destabilize foreign governments is, by this point, self-evident. But what if you were a totalitarian tyrant looking to quell domestic dissent? Never fear. Just because these tactics can be employed to overthrow governments abroad, doesn't mean they can't be used for smaller-scale operations at home. In 2007, undercover Quebec provincial police infiltrated the peaceful protests at the Montebello Security and Prosperity Partnership Summit. The masked undercover officers were spotted with rocks in their hands approaching the police line, but when called out by one of the protesters, were then arrested by the police and taken away. Within days, the government was forced to admit that the men had indeed been undercover police officers.
It was stunning video posted on the internet for all to see, and it came with a charge that police masqueraded as protesters at this week's Montebello Summit to incite violence. Tonight, an equally stunning admission from Quebec's provincial police. Susan Bonner reports.
These 3 guys are cops, everybody!
Busted. 3 Quebec provincial police officers, identities masked, one carrying a huge rock,
Hey, put the rock down!
nabbed for infiltrating a peaceful protest at Montebello. The tip-off came from a union leader who noticed riot police standing by despite the obvious weapon. He accused the men of being undercover cops trying to provoke a riot and end the protest. The men were removed but never charged. After 2 days of questions, the Sûreté du Québec issued a news release late today confirming, yes, the men are police officers, but denying they were agents provocateurs, claiming they were sent in to identify and stop trouble.
Brother, take your mask off! No! Put the rock down, man! Put the rock down! Hey! Put the rock down! This is our line! You fucking cops! You fucking cops! Get out of town! Cops out of town! Hey, Steve! Hey, Steve! Leave these guys alone! That's our line! Okay! You're fucking cops! Okay!
And so, when it came time for Toronto to host the G20 summit in 2010, Dan Dix of Press for Truth confronted Toronto police spokesman George Tucker about the possibility that similar provocateur tactics would be used there. Tucker's response was hardly reassuring.
In 2007, there was a summit that was held in Montebello, Quebec, where 3 Sûreté du Québec police officers were caught as agent provocateurs. They were dressed as aggressive protesters with rocks in their hands in an attempt to incite violence. George, as a representative of the Toronto Police, can you assure us that the Toronto Police Force will not engage in any police provocateur agent activities at the G20 summit?
Other matters, security matters, I'm not at liberty to discuss those in an open format.
And, predictably, when the G20 rolled around, the police were up to their old tricks. Protesters who had been outed as undercover cops were caught running behind police lines, protected by their fellow officers. Crowds of identically clad black bloc protesters were allowed to rampage through the streets for hours on the first day of the protests, so that a clampdown could begin the next day, resulting in the largest mass arrests in Canadian history. And in one incident that became the iconic image of the Toronto G20, police carefully parked and deliberately abandoned a police cruiser in the middle of the protests, and then allowed the masked protesters to smash it to pieces and set it on fire, letting it burn for hours in full view of the cameras of the mainstream news networks.
As you're seeing behind me, the black spots on the pavement from where the police cars were burned yesterday by alleged anarchist groups down here on Queen Street West in Spadina. Now, I was here filming the event as it took place. When those police cars got left, I think an important note to make is that the police cars were driven in by police, which then they got out of the police cars, surrounded them in a C formation with a number of riot cops, and then the riot cops backed off and left the police cars there. And I filmed it after the police cars were left. There was one on either side of the street. Both of the police cars were being destroyed incrementally by various protest groups, but they weren't lit on fire for about 6 or 7 hours. These cars were left here for 6 or 7 hours on this street. Now, the police have tow trucks. They have tow trucks that are paid for by our tax money with the $1 billion that they've been spending for security. 6 or 7 hours they were left here on the street, and then about 6 p.m. the cars were allegedly lit on fire by anarchist groups. They were also left to burn. After they were lit on fire, they were left to burn for nearly an hour until the cars were nearly molten metal on the street. Now, the police had every opportunity to call a fire engine down, to put these fires out, to cordon off the area to get these vehicles out of here, but they needed some sort of a reason to crack down on people all over the city. Now we're seeing arrests all over the city, we're seeing detainments, we're seeing people going into people's houses, and this is all caused by these alleged groups that lit a few police cars on fire. They wanted to leave this happening as a photo opportunity to discredit legitimate protesters that were protesting the G20. There's over 500 people now in the film studios down there that are being detained unlawfully against our Constitution, against our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and against the right to free speech and the freedom to stand up for what you believe in this country.
In 2016, the Ontario courts finally granted the ability for the more than 1,000 peaceful protesters illegally detained during the summit to join a class action lawsuit against the Toronto police force. But that appeal was then dismissed by the Supreme Court at the urging of the police board. The top-ranking officer who ordered the illegal mass arrests, Superintendent Mark Fenton, was found guilty of professional misconduct for his actions, but that only led to a reprimand and the loss of 30 days paid vacation. In the end, the engineered crisis worked perfectly. The images of the flaming cop car played across the mainstream propaganda channels all weekend, justifying the kettling and mass arrests of over 1,000 peaceful protesters in the minds of an easily duped public, still enthralled by the narrative of the mainstream media networks. One officer received a slap on the wrist, and no one was ever charged, let alone prosecuted, for the use of undercover provocateurs who instigated the violence in the first place. To be sure, this is by no means a strictly Canadian phenomenon. At the 2009 G20 in London, a tiny group of masked individuals who the media identified as protesters stage-managed a carefully contrived smashing of the windows of an HSBC branch for a gaggle of press photographers who in fact overwhelmingly outnumbered the so-called protesters. Not caught on their cameras was any sign of any of the police that were prevalent at all times and all areas throughout the G20 demonstrations. And in 2008, the Denver Post reported that undercover Denver police, dressed as protesters, had instigated a struggle with uniformed police that resulted in 106 people being arrested and an indiscriminate pepper spray attack against the assembled crowds. Time and again, in country after country, engineered crises have been used to further the goals of deep state agents and would-be tyrants. Undercover forces are sent into situations to stir up crowds, instigate violence, raise tensions, and justify the next move on the chessboard, whether that be the toppling of the government or the delegitimization of peaceful protest. And time again, with controlled media organizations on hand to document the events in a biased and uncritical manner, these engineered crises have helped these operatives accomplish their mission. So don't worry. The next time you need to engineer a coup, whip up a violent movement, or clamp down on dissent, just know that you are only one engineered crisis away from achieving your goal. Unless, of course, the public wakes up to the trick. But since this guide to engineering crises is our little secret, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Is it?